I welcome you to today's episode of our podcast series, Autonomous Waffensystems and Human Control. In this episode, we will look at the perspective of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Our guest today is Georgia Hinds. A warm welcome to you. Georgia Hinds is a legal advisor for the ICRC, and she's currently working on legal aspects of new technologies of warfare, including autonomous weapons. Ms. Hinds, as entry question, I would like to know what the ICRC's definition of autonomous weapons is.
So the characterization that we have put forward, and I would say is largely supported by the majority of states at this point, is that autonomous weapon systems are those in which, after initial activation by a human, the weapon system selects and applies force to targets without further human intervention. So the key point for us is that it's the system itself that initiates or triggers a strike based on a generalized targeting profile. And that's not a technology-specific definition. So you might have an autonomous weapon system that incorporates, say, something like artificial intelligence, but for us, that isn't the defining feature. And I would say that we have systems already in use, many of the air missile defense systems that militaries are using, close-in weapon systems. For us, these would fall within the scope of an autonomous weapon system. However, they don't raise necessarily humanitarian or legal concerns at this stage.
What developments and trends in armed conflicts is the ICRC observing with regard to autonomous weapons?
So we are seeing trends in both the development of systems, but also in militaries signaling their intention to use these systems in new ways that are raising concerns from a humanitarian, legal, and ethical perspective. In the systems themselves, we're seeing a push towards integrating more complex technologies, in particular deep learning or machine learning, forms of artificial intelligence, and then also to operate potentially in swarm technology. We're also seeing then with the operating parameters a push to broaden the scope, to have them operating against a wider range of targets for longer periods of time and over wider geographic areas. And so essentially we're looking at this as a shift from using them as a weapon of last resort to, say, defend a ship or an area, into something more proactive that is essentially hunting or trying to find enemy vehicles, potentially even people. And so this brings in the recommendations that we've made for new law to be prohibiting certain types of autonomous weapons, but setting operating constraints on non-prohibited systems.
And in this context, do you think that autonomous weapons have the potential to minimize the risks for civilians?
We do hear this argument a lot, and certainly we think that automating certain functions in weapon systems can produce better outcomes for civilians in armed conflict. So in particular, in the context of urban warfare, we've looked at how automating guidance functions in munitions to something more like a precision-guided munition can result in more precise strikes and potentially improve compliance with international humanitarian law. But that same argument doesn't hold for autonomous weapons, where you have both the functions of selecting and applying force to targets conducted autonomously. Because with those weapons, in our view, what you have is actually increased unpredictability. You have a reduction in precision because the user knows less about what the ultimate strike will be, where it will be conducted, against what, and the specific operational details at that time. And so you can have a weapon system that might very accurately strike something, but if that something isn't a military objective at the time, then that strike won't be precise. I think the other argument that's sometimes made in this context is that autonomous weapons won't be subject to fear or to rage or revenge or fatigue. Now, I think that falsely compares a human making a decision with an autonomous weapon carrying out a machine process. What you really need to compare is a human using an autonomous weapon against a human using a non-autonomous weapon. And the way in which that autonomous weapon might produce outcomes that are not compliant with IHL depends on how it's deployed by a human and how it's programmed as well.
In the context of predictability, international humanitarian law requires that the effects of a weapon system must be predictable for the user. When does the ICRC consider this to be the case regarding autonomous weapon systems?
That's right. So we consider that the requirements of international humanitarian law require that weapons users are able to anticipate and control or limit the effects of their attacks, of their weapons, essentially. If they can't, then that would be an indiscriminate attack under IHL. And so for us, this brings into play the need to be able to predict how the weapon system will function in a given situation. Now, with an autonomous weapon, what a commander or a weapon user is essentially having to do when they launch it is to reasonably foresee all the possible strikes that might take place, depending on how the system interacts with its environment and the input then received through its sensors. Now, in an armed conflict, which is characterized by volatile situations, enemies using deception tactics, potentially hacking of that system or data poisoning, it can become very, very difficult for the commander to do this. So what we've essentially said is that this is likely to only be possible as an exercise if you have very strict constraints on the system itself, making sure that it is reasonably predictable, and also on the operating environment. So only using it within set parameters geographically over a set period of time against certain types of targets to really lock down that number of possibilities to a reasonable level that a commander can actually assess the lawfulness of an attack in advance.
One of the major military advantages of autonomous weapons is the increase in speed of the decision-making. Does this increased speed create additional risks?
That's right. So the increase in speed, often coupled with an increase in scale, potentially also the ability to operate in communications-denied environments, these are all cited as drivers behind the development and use of autonomous weapons. But I would very much caution against conflating those military benefits with a humanitarian benefit, because actually what we've observed in previous conflicts with traditional weapons is that increasing the tempo of military operations can create additional risks for civilians. So not only does it potentially increase the risk of, say, miscalculations, and that can affect not only civilians but combatants as well, it also reduces the time available for commanders and combatants to be assessing and taking all feasible precautions to minimize the harm to civilians, which is an obligation under IHL. So we've argued that with increased time, you see more, you understand more, and it gives you time to develop alternative courses of action potentially. So reducing that, in our view, does create additional risks.
The ICRC published a policy paper where a distinction is made between autonomous weapons that specifically attack people, also described as anti-personnel autonomous weapons, and the rest of the autonomous weapons that attack military hardware, military objectives. Why does the ICRC attach a great importance to this distinction?
That's right. So in our recommendations, one of the prohibited systems is those that target humans directly. So this is based both on legal concerns but also on ethical. From a legal perspective, we find it very difficult to envisage a realistic combat situation in which the use of an autonomous weapon against a human wouldn't pose a significant risk of an IHL violation. And that's because in armed conflict, the way in which people become protected from attack can change very rapidly and is complicated based on context-dependent factors. So for civilians, for instance, they will only lose their protection from attack if they directly participate in hostilities, and they will only lose that protection for such time as they directly participate. So the fact that a commander might have made an assessment in advance that anyone within a certain area constitutes a legitimate combatant, that can shift very quickly. Even for armed forces, they can become wounded or sick or surrender, and there's not an exhaustive category of signals for how they can do that can be easily programmed into an autonomous weapon. So then that's the legal side. From an ethical perspective, there is just a fundamental red line, with allowing life or death outcomes to be determined based on a machine process. We've consulted ethicists who have reinforced that this would undermine the human dignity of the person targeted, but it would also remove the moral agency of the person using force. And that's not something that you can fix with more sophisticated artificial intelligence or some technological improvement. Finally, just to give some examples, I would say we can draw on our experience in disarmament law, where we have made distinctions between weapons that target people and those that target objects. Landmines are the key example here, but I think we should also look at other things such as incendiary weapons or flame-throwing weapons, which are prohibited against certain classes of people and not necessarily against objects. And then the use of something like blinding laser weapons, which are prohibited based on the effect that they have on humans.
Ms. Hinds, for the ICRC, the human-centered approach in armed conflicts is essential. Could you elaborate on this point regarding autonomous weapons?
That's right. So the human-centered approach is the way in which we approach disarmament, but also IHL more generally historically. What it means in practice is focusing on the human cost of weapon systems and their use in armed conflicts, and trying to preserve the well-being of human populations. So that means prioritizing prevention and reducing reliance on militarized approaches to peace and security. So if we're looking at how to promote the well-being of human populations in these laws, we need to be thinking about, say, factors like public health, public safety, environmental impacts. And this is something that's been picked up by, say, the United Nations Secretary General in his new Agenda for Peace published last year. For the ICRC, it also has this dual aspect, so not only looking at the effect on people in armed conflict, but also the effect on the human user's ability to comply with international humanitarian law, because that compliance is how we uphold and reduce the effects on civilians and other protected people in armed conflict.
And from the viewpoint of the ICRC, what type and quality of human control should be in place when autonomous weapon systems are deployed in an armed conflict?
So human control is central as a guiding principle behind all of our recommendations for new law. And here I'm talking about human control over the effects of the weapon system or over the attack itself. Because, as I said earlier, international humanitarian law requires commanders and combatants to be able to anticipate and to limit the effects of those weapons. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to have direct control over the weapon system at all times. Something like a remotely piloted drone, a remotely controlled armed drone, that would actually not constitute an autonomous weapon system at that point because there would be that human intervention. But in terms of how you then operationalize or implement human control in an autonomous weapon, for us, we think that this means that first you need to prohibit certain systems, unpredictable autonomous weapons that would not allow that kind of anticipation and control because you don't know how they will function in a given situation. Also prohibiting anti-personnel systems for the reasons I spoke about before, because it's very, very difficult to anticipate all those possibilities. And then if you have a predictable system only operating against objects, you need to be locking down the operating environment and the parameters in which that system is used. So limiting the types of targets against the system is used against, limiting the geographic scope, the duration over which it's used, and considering what level of human supervision or the ability to intervene is needed to uphold that control over your effects.
Ms. Hinds, we have already reached the end of the interview. I would like to thank you very much for the conversation and for sharing your insights with us. At this point, I also thank our audience for listening.